Baltimore, Maryland, October 1944. The Cordell Applied Chemistry Laboratory occupied a converted tobacco warehouse on the eastern edge of Baltimore's industrial district, 3 blocks from the harbor where Liberty ships slid into the Patapsco River every 42 hours. The building was 4 stories of red brick and narrow windows, built in 1889 by the Cordell Brothers Tobacco Company, and repurposed in 1941 when the War Department needed research facilities for chemical weapons development. Marion Hutchins had sat at the reception desk just inside the entrance for 2 years and 10 months, and in that time she had become invisible. Hundreds of scientists, engineers, military liaisons, and government inspectors passed her desk every day, arriving at 7 in the morning, departing at 6 in the evening, sometimes working through the night when deadlines pressed, and not one lifted their eyes to meet hers. She was part of the architecture, like the coat rack beside the door, or the radiator that clanked in winter. A wooden desk, a worn leather chair, a visitor logbook, a black telephone with a rotary dial, and an electric hot plate for coffee. These defined the boundaries of her world. 43 years of life, and the last 2 years and 10 months spent in this 12-foot square of linoleum between the entrance and the staircase to the second floor. October 18th, 1944. 9:15 in the morning, the laboratory director Harlan Vandemeer shouted at her in front of the entire morning shift, his voice echoing through the entrance hall and carrying up the iron stairwell to the 4th floor where the classified munitions work happened. She had asked him for his identification badge. Just the badge. From the director, who had walked through security without showing credentials for 18 straight months since the day of his appointment. Marion said nothing. She lowered her eyes and continued sitting at her post. Her hands trembled as she recorded the names of subsequent visitors in the logbook. Her heart hammered so loudly it seemed everyone in the lobby must hear it. Her cheeks burned with shame. She felt dozens of eyes on her, curious, pitying, mocking. Heard stifled laughter from somewhere near the stairwell. Saw a young laboratory assistant standing by the door shake her head and turn away. But in that moment, something inside Marion snapped. A thin thread that had held her in a state of docile silence for 2 years and 10 months broke with an almost audible crack. And she remembered everything. Absolutely everything she had witnessed in those 2 years and 10 months. Every midnight meeting, every whispered conversation in the corridor, every envelope passed hand to hand, every frightened look from a terminated employee, every tear from a wife who came begging for her husband's job, every lie the director told into the telephone receiver while standing 6 feet from her desk, every nighttime visitor in an expensive dress with smeared lipstick, every thick envelope that disappeared into the director's briefcase, every document marked ____0___, carried out of the laboratory by men in civilian clothes who never signed the visitor log. All this time she had been a ghost. But ghosts see what the living cannot see. And ghosts possess memory. Perfect, merciless, photographic memory. Marion Hutchins was born in January 1901 in a farming community called Willow Creek, 40 miles outside Roanoke, Virginia. Her father worked as a blacksmith, her mother as a washerwoman for a wealthy landowner's household. The family was poor but close-knit. Marion completed 8 grades at the county schoolhouse. There was no money for more. At 18, she married a neighbor boy named Clayton Hutchins. He worked for the Norfolk and Western Railway, earned decent wages, promised to take her to the city. In 1921, they moved to Baltimore, rented 2 rooms in a boarding house in Fells Point. Clayton got work as a mechanic at the railroad depot, Marion as a cleaning woman at a public school. They had no children. 3 times she miscarried, and doctors told her further attempts would risk her life. On December 8, 1941, one day after Pearl Harbor, Clayton enlisted in the Army. He left for basic training on December 15th, promised to be home by Christmas 1942. Marion saw him off at Pennsylvania Station, stood on the platform until his train disappeared around the bend toward Washington. That was the last time. In August 1942, a telegram arrived. Private Clayton R. Hutchins, killed in action, Guadalcanal. He was 43 years old. Marion was 41. The telegram came on a Thursday afternoon. Marion was at the boarding house preparing dinner when the Western Union messenger knocked on the door. She knew immediately what it was. Everyone knew what those yellow envelopes meant. She signed for it with trembling hands, closed the door, stood in the narrow hallway staring at the envelope for 5 full minutes before she could bring herself to open it. When she finally read the words, her legs gave out. She sat on the floor in the hallway, the telegram clutched in her hand, and wept until she had no tears left. The landlady found her there 2 hours later, still sitting on the floor, the telegram crumpled in her lap. Mrs. Kowalczyk helped Marion to her room, made her tea, sat with her through the night. But nothing could fill the void that had opened inside Marion's chest. In the days that followed, Marion moved through life mechanically. She went to her cleaning job at the school, scrubbed floors, emptied trash, spoke to no one. Came home to the boarding house, sat in her room, stared at Clayton's photograph on the dresser. At night, she lay awake, replaying their last conversation on the train platform. He had joked about the army food, said he'd probably lose weight. She had laughed, kissed him, made him promise to write every week. He had kept that promise. She had received 17 letters before the telegram came. Now there would be no more letters, no more promises, no more future. The boarding house became unbearable. Every room reminded her of Clayton. The chair where he used to sit reading the newspaper, the corner of the kitchen where they had danced one New Year's Eve when the radio played their favorite song, the narrow bed they had shared for 20 years. She could not stay there, could not sleep in that bed alone, could not walk those halls without seeing his ghost at every turn. In September 1942, 6 weeks after the telegram, Marion gave notice at the boarding house and at her cleaning job. She had a distant relation in Baltimore, a second cousin named Estelle Pritchard, who worked as a custodian at a government research facility that had been established the previous year. Marion contacted Estelle, explained her situation. Estelle responded immediately. "Come to Baltimore, I will help you." Marion packed her few belongings, 2 suitcases containing clothes, photographs, Clayton's letters, his army uniform that had been returned with his personal effects, and moved to the city. Estelle lived in a tenement building in Canton, in a single room that smelled of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. She cleared space in a corner for Marion's cot, helped her find work at the Cordell Applied Chemistry Laboratory where Estelle herself was employed. The facility needed a reception desk security clerk, someone to sit at the entrance, check identification badges, record visitors in a log, answer the telephone. The work was simple, required no special skills. The pay was modest, but it came with a war ration supplement and coal allocation for winter. For a widow with no family and no prospects, it meant survival. Marion started work on December 1st, 1942. She sat at the wooden desk just inside the entrance, learned the routines, memorized the faces of regular staff. The work was mindless, which suited her. She did not want to think, did not want to feel. She wanted only to sit at that desk, record names in the logbook, answer the phone when it rang, and let the hours pass until she could return to her cot in Estelle's room and sleep. The laboratory occupied the former tobacco warehouse on Conkling Street, 4 floors of brick with high ceilings and creaking wooden stairs. In late 1942, about 70 people worked there, mostly women and men classified 4F, unfit for military service. They developed chemical formulations for military use, explosives, incendiary compounds, decontamination solutions, smokescreen agents. Marion understood nothing about chemistry, but she watched the staff work 16-hour shifts, collapsing from exhaustion but continuing. The director then was an elderly professor named Dr. Cornelius Pemberton Ashworth, a kind, absent-minded man who always greeted her by name and asked how she was managing. He remembered that she was a war widow, sometimes brought her extra ration coupons, once gave her a wool scarf when winter came. He died in February 1943 during a German U-boat scare when he had a heart attack descending to the basement shelter during an air raid drill. Marion attended his funeral, stood in the back of the church, wept for this kind man who had treated her with dignity. After Dr. Ashworth, the assistant director was promoted, Dr. Fletcher Montgomery Kirkland, an energetic man of about 50 who immediately began reorganizing operations. Under his leadership, the laboratory expanded, acquired additional floors in an adjacent building, increased staff to 120. Marion remembered Dr. Kirkland as strict but fair. He too greeted her each morning, learned details about her life, asked about her well-being. Once he noticed she was limping. She had twisted her ankle on the icy sidewalk outside and insisted she take the afternoon off, arranged for someone to walk her home. In early 1943, Dr. Kirkland was transferred to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, for a higher-level government project. Before he left, he stopped at Marion's desk, shook her hand, thanked her for her dedicated service. "You're the backbone of this place," he told her. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Marion remembered those words. They were among the kindest anyone had spoken to her since Clayton's death. The new director appointed was Harlan Vandemeer. Vandemeer was 38 years old, ambitious, well-connected, with influential friends in the War Production Board and the Office of Scientific Research and Development. He held a doctorate in chemical engineering from MIT, had won a Navy E award for excellence in production efficiency at a previous munitions facility. He arrived with grand plans. Transform the laboratory into the nation's premier chemical warfare research center, win more government contracts, build new wings, open 15 new research units, perhaps achieve appointment to a federal science advisory board after the war. Marion remembered his first day, March 22, 1943. He arrived in a black Packard sedan, stepped out wearing a new overcoat, walked past her desk without a glance, and disappeared into his office on the 4th floor. From that day forward, 18 months passed. In those 18 months, Harlan Vandemeer never once, not a single time, greeted her, never once addressed her by name, never once looked her in the eye. To him, she did not exist. She was air, furniture, part of the wall. But she existed for those who came to the director at night. Marion worked rotating shifts, day shift from 7 to 3, evening shift from 3 to 11, sometimes night shift from 11 to 7 in the morning. The schedule was posted a month in advance. On average, she worked nights twice per month. During those nights, she witnessed what no one was supposed to witness. The first time occurred in April 1943, 3 weeks after Vandemeer's arrival. Marion remembered the exact date, April 14th, a Wednesday. It was 12:30 in the morning. The laboratory was empty except for the night watchman, Gerald Kowalski, who made rounds every 2 hours. Marion sat at her desk reading the Baltimore Sun. The front page carried news of Allied advances in North Africa, photographs of German prisoners being marched into camps. Suddenly, the front door opened, admitting a gust of damp spring air, and a man entered wearing a dark coat and a fedora pulled low over his eyes. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat onto the linoleum floor. He walked straight toward the staircase without presenting identification, without greeting her, without explaining his purpose. Marion tried to stop him. Quote 3. The man turned and looked at her. His eyes contained something inhuman, coldness, emptiness, a kind of calculated threat that made her blood freeze. He said nothing, just looked. And Marion fell silent, lowered her eyes, pretended to read the newspaper. The man climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, his footsteps echoing in the empty building. 5 minutes later, Director Vandemeer descended, in shirt sleeves, no tie, hair disheveled, as though he had been sleeping in his office. He went back upstairs with the visitor. Marion heard footsteps overhead. The director's office was directly above the entrance hall. Then silence. She sat at her desk, heart pounding, wondering if she should call someone, notify the police. But who would believe her? The director himself had greeted the visitor. Clearly, this was an authorized meeting. She was nobody to question it. 45 minutes later, they descended. The director escorted the visitor to the door. They spoke quietly, and Marion, straining to hear, caught fragments. "Documents are ready. You needn't worry. I'll transfer the rest next week. No one will know. I guarantee it." The man nodded, said something in a language Marion did not recognize, perhaps German, though she could not be certain, and exited into the rainy darkness. The director stood by the door, looked toward Marion. No, not at her, through her, as though she were a piece of furniture, and returned to his office. Light showed in the fourth-floor windows until 4 in the morning. Next morning, when Marion handed off to the day-shift receptionist, Beatrice Calloway, she mentioned the midnight visitor. Had Beatrice ever seen such a thing? Beatrice, an older woman who had worked there since the facility opened in 1941, looked frightened and grabbed Marion's wrist with surprising strength. Quote 7. Quote, she whispered urgently, glancing toward the stairs as though someone might be listening. Quote 8. Quote. Marion nodded, unsettled by Beatrice's intensity, but she did not forget. She remembered. The man's face, sharp features, cold eyes, that thin scar on his left cheek. His voice, the director's words. Over the next 18 months, such visits became routine, once or twice monthly, always during Marion's night shifts. She began to suspect the schedule was deliberately arranged so she would be the one on duty. Always the same pattern. A man in a dark coat and hat would arrive between midnight and 2 in the morning, never sign the visitor log, proceed directly to the fourth floor. The director would come down to meet him, always already in the building, always waiting, as though he knew exactly when they would arrive. They would spend between 30 minutes and 2 hours in the director's office. Then the visitor would leave. Sometimes Marion recognized the same faces recurring. Sometimes new faces appeared. All had the same quality: the cold eyes, the deliberate movements, the aura of controlled menace that made ordinary people step aside. Marion began taking mental notes. She could not write anything down, too dangerous if discovered. But she had an excellent memory, trained through years of memorizing Bible verses in childhood, and later recipes and household accounts. Dates, times, physical descriptions, snippets of overheard conversation. After each incident, she would return to Estelle's tenement, lie on her cot in the darkness while Estelle snored in the bed across the room, and review everything she had witnessed, committing it to memory the way she had once memorized the books of the Old Testament. She noted other irregularities. During daytime hours, she observed Director Vandemeer meeting with men who wore no identification badges, who signed the visitor log with obviously false names. Quote 9, quote 10, quote 11. Names no real person would actually use. These men were escorted immediately to the fourth floor without passing through normal security screening. Marion saw thick manila envelopes exchanged, the visitors arriving with bulging briefcases, departing with them noticeably flattened. She saw Vandemeer make telephone calls from the phone on the wall near her desk, his voice low and urgent, speaking in what sounded like fragments of German or perhaps a code. Once she heard him say into the phone, quote 12. Then he glanced toward Marion, 20 feet away, apparently absorbed in her logbook, and abruptly changed tone, his voice becoming loud and cheerful. Quote 13. She observed financial irregularities. Government auditors would arrive, announced and unannounced, requesting access to accounting records. Vandemeer would personally retrieve certain documents from the locked file room on the fourth floor. He alone had the key, a security measure he had instituted shortly after his arrival. Marion noticed that sometimes he emerged from the file room carrying fewer folders than when he entered. Documents were being removed, concealed, destroyed. During one inspection in September 1943, a young auditor from the War Production Board named Eugene Callahan spent 2 hours examining procurement records, and then asked to see supporting invoices for chemical supplies ordered from a company called Precision Chemical Corporation. Vandemeer provided a box of invoices. The auditor looked confused, held up 2 invoices side by side, pointed out discrepancies. Underscore underscore quote underscore 14 underscore underscore. Vandemeer became suddenly angry, his face flushing red. Underscore underscore quote underscore 15 underscore underscore. The young auditor stammered. Quote underscore 16 quote. Vandemeer shouted. Quote underscore 17 quote. The young auditor left, visibly shaken, nearly in tears. 3 days later, a different auditor arrived. An older man named Mr. Patterson performed a perfunctory review lasting barely an hour, signed off on everything without questions, shook Vandemeer's hand warmly before departing. Marion witnessed personnel abuses. Loyal employees, chemists who had worked there since 1941, laboratory technicians who routinely put in 70-hour weeks without complaint, would suddenly be terminated, escorted from the building by security, forbidden to discuss the reasons for dismissal, or even to collect their personal belongings from their desks. Their spouses would sometimes appear at Marion's desk days later, weeping, desperate, begging to see the director, asking what their husbands or wives had done wrong, pleading for reinstatement, explaining they had children to feed, rent to pay, nowhere else to turn. Marion had no answers to give them. She could only listen, offer sympathetic words, sometimes slip them a few dollars from her own meager wages. She noticed that the terminated employees shared a common trait. They had questioned certain procedures, asked about missing inventory, expressed concern about unexplained absences of classified materials. One such employee was Dr. Millard Thaddeus Parnell, a senior chemist who had been with the laboratory since its founding in 1941. Dr. Parnell was a quiet, methodical man in his 50s, a widower who lived alone and devoted himself entirely to his work. He often worked late into the night, and Marion had developed a friendly rapport with him. He would stop at her desk when leaving at midnight or 1 in the morning, chat briefly about the weather or the war news, sometimes share cookies his sister sent from Pennsylvania. In February 1944, Dr. Parnell came to Marion's desk in obvious distress. His hands shook. His face was pale. He asked if he could use the telephone to make a private call. Marion stepped away to give him privacy, walked to the far end of the entrance hall, pretended to examine the fire extinguisher. She heard fragments of his conversation. Something wrong with the burn rates. Tested them 3 times, same results. Formulations don't match what we submitted to the War Department. Someone has altered the documentation. I'm telling you, if these munitions are deployed in the field, they won't function properly. Soldiers could die. The conversation lasted perhaps 5 minutes. When Dr. Parnell hung up, his face was grim. He thanked Marion, returned to his laboratory. 2 days later, Dr. Parnell was gone. Vandemeer announced at a staff meeting that Parnell had been caught stealing research materials for personal profit and had been dismissed and reported to military authorities. No one dared question the explanation. But Marion knew Dr. Parnell. She had watched him work late into countless nights, had seen his dedication, his integrity. The accusation made no sense. Unless the real reason for his termination was that he had discovered something he should not have discovered. Marion also witnessed what happened to people who got too close to the truth. In June 1944, a military intelligence officer, Captain Theodore Vance, arrived unannounced to conduct what he called a routine security assessment. Captain Vance was a young man, perhaps 30, with an earnest manner and kind eyes. He interviewed staff members, reviewed documentation, spent considerable time examining the procedures for handling classified materials. On his 3rd day at the facility, he stopped at Marion's desk during a quiet afternoon. They chatted briefly. He asked how long she had worked there, whether she enjoyed the work, whether she had family in Baltimore. Then, casually, he asked. Marion hesitated. Captain Vance seemed trustworthy. He treated everyone respectfully, spoke kindly even to the cleaning staff. She almost told him. Almost opened her mouth and described the midnight visitors, the false names in the logbook, the destroyed documents. But at that moment, Director Vandemeer appeared, seemingly from nowhere, and interrupted. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 21, underscore, underscore. Vandemeer placed a hand on the captain's shoulder, steered him toward the stairs, talking rapidly about inventory procedures. The captain glanced back at Marion, a puzzled expression on his face, as though he sensed the interruption was deliberate. That was the last time she saw him. The next morning, Marion arrived at work to find a new military intelligence officer, Major Russell Pemberton, completing the security assessment. When Marion asked what happened to Captain Vance, Major Pemberton said coldly, his eyes hard, "Captain Vance was recalled to Washington for reassignment. I'll be finishing his work." The assessment concluded 3 days later with a glowing report praising Vandemeer's management and security procedures. Marion never saw Captain Vance again. She wondered if he had been reassigned or silenced. Through it all, Marion remained silent. She had no proof, only observations. Who would believe a middle-aged widow working as a receptionist? She was nobody, a ghost, invisible. If she spoke up and was dismissed as a confused woman imagining things, Vandemeer would learn of it. And then she would disappear, like Dr. Parnell, like Captain Vance, like all the others who had gotten too close to the truth. But ghosts accumulate knowledge, and Marion's knowledge grew more detailed, more damning, month after month. She learned the pattern of the nighttime visitors. They came on specific dates, the 14th and 28th of each month, with rare exceptions when dates shifted by a day or two, presumably for operational security. They always arrived between midnight and 2 in the morning. They spent exactly 40 to 90 minutes in Vandemeer's office. They never brought briefcases or packages when arriving with empty hands. They always carried something when departing: envelopes, folders, small wrapped parcels that bulged in their coat pockets. She learned to recognize the men. There were 4 regular visitors. The first, the one from that initial April 1943 encounter, was tall, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches, with dark hair graying at the temples, a thin scar on his left cheek visible when he turned toward the light, possibly German or Austrian by his sharp features and the way he held himself with military rigidity. He wore expensive clothes, well-tailored overcoats, fine leather shoes that clicked on the linoleum, spoke very little, moved with military precision. The second was shorter, heavy-set, with a round face and thick glasses, always nervous, always sweating even in winter, constantly dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. He seemed ill-suited for espionage work, too anxious, too conspicuous, but he came regularly nonetheless. The third was medium height, nondescript, the kind of face you forget immediately, which Marion realized was precisely the point. He had mastered the art of being unremarkable. The fourth was a woman, which surprised Marion the first time she appeared in July 1943. Late 30s, elegant, sophisticated, with platinum blonde hair styled in careful waves, expensive perfume that lingered in the entrance hall long after she departed, a European accent Marion could not quite place. She stayed longer than the men, sometimes 3 hours, and twice Marion heard laughter coming from the director's office during her visits, not the laughter of a business meeting. Marion memorized conversations. In August 1943, she overheard the tall man with the scar say to Vandemeer as they descended the stairs, their voices carrying in the quiet building, "Berlin is very pleased with the last delivery. The shipment last month exceeded all expectations. The formulations performed exactly as promised." Vandemeer replied, his voice smug, "Good. I told you I deliver quality. When can I expect the next payment?" The tall man, "Thursday. Same account, Switzerland. But Berlin is requesting something additional." Vandemeer, cautiously, "What additional?" The tall man, "The decontamination protocols, the complete documentation." Vandemeer, "That will require additional compensation." The tall man smiled thinly. "Of course, double the usual rate." They shook hands before the man departed into the night. In November 1943, the nervous, heavy-set man handed Vandemeer an envelope and said, his voice trembling slightly, "These are the new requirements from our friends overseas. They need the incendiary formula adjusted for winter conditions in the Eastern Theater. Current formulations don't ignite reliably below freezing. Vandemeer opened the envelope, scanned the contents. That will require additional laboratory work, new testing protocols, additional resources. The man. The funds are already arranged. $50,000, deposited in your account in Zurich. But they want delivery by January 15th. Vandemeer. January 15th is tight. I'll need to prioritize this over the legitimate War Department contracts. The man. Do what you must. Just deliver on time. Vandemeer nodded. Consider it done. In March 1944, Marion overheard the platinum blonde woman tell Vandemeer, her voice sharp, "You're taking too many risks, Harlan. That auditor from the War Production Board, the one you had removed, people in Washington are asking questions. And that military intelligence officer, the captain you had reassigned, his superiors wanted to know why he was pulled from the investigation." Vandemeer, unconcerned. "Let them ask. I have protection at the highest levels. People who owe me favors. People who are being paid to look the other way." The woman. "Protection isn't permanent. The war won't last forever. What happens when the shooting stops and accountants start looking closely at the books? When investigators have time to dig into the irregularities?" Vandemeer, confidently. "By then, I'll be elsewhere. I've already arranged my exit. Argentina, perhaps. Or Switzerland. Somewhere beyond American jurisdiction." The woman laughed, a cold sound without humor. "You always were a planner, Harlan. That's what I admire about you. No sentimentality, no loyalty, just pure calculation." They clinked glasses. Marion heard the sound clearly, celebrating their treachery. Marion assembled the pieces. Director Vandemeer was selling classified research to foreign agents, almost certainly German intelligence. He was embezzling government funds, inflating procurement costs and pocketing the difference, ordering chemicals at legitimate prices but submitting invoices showing higher prices, the difference going into his Swiss bank accounts. He was falsifying research results, providing the military with chemical formulations that did not match specifications, which meant American soldiers in the field might be using defective weapons that would fail at critical moments, costing lives. He was eliminating anyone who threatened to expose him, through termination, intimidation, or worse. He had accomplices in government agencies, corrupt officials protecting him from oversight in exchange for money or favors. And Marion, invisible Marion, sitting at her desk with her logbook and telephone, was the only person who knew the full scope of it. For 18 months, she carried this knowledge alone. It was a crushing weight. Every morning she arrived at work, greeted employees cheerfully, logged visitors, answered phones, made coffee on her hot plate, pretended normalcy. Every night she lay on her cot in Estelle's tenement room, her mind churning through what she had seen, what she had heard, trying to decide what to do. She was afraid, deeply afraid. These were not ordinary criminals. These were people capable of murder, connected to an enemy intelligence service at war with America. They had already eliminated Captain Vance, a military officer. What would they do to a middle-aged widow working as a receptionist if they suspected she knew anything? She would simply disappear, perhaps fall down the stairs and break her neck, perhaps be struck by a car crossing the street, perhaps develop a sudden illness and die quietly in her sleep. Who would investigate? Who would care? She was nobody. She was also doubtful anyone would believe her. She had no physical evidence, no documents, no photographs, no recordings, just her memory and her observations. If she went to the authorities and they dismissed her as a confused woman imagining things, Vandemeer would learn of it. He seemed to have eyes everywhere. And then she would disappear, like Dr. Parnell, like Captain Vance, like all the others who had gotten too close. So she remained silent, invisible and silent, watching, remembering, waiting. Perhaps waiting for courage, perhaps waiting for a sign, perhaps simply waiting for the war to end, hoping the problem would resolve itself. Until October 18, 1944. That morning, Harlan Prescott Vandemeer strode through the entrance at 9:14. Marion, following the new directive from the War Production Board that all personnel, regardless of rank, must display identification at all times. The directive had been posted on the bulletin board for 2 weeks, asked to see his badge. Vandemeer stopped mid-stride, turned slowly, stared at her as if she had spoken in a foreign language. Then his face twisted with fury, his features contorting into something ugly. Marion, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. __quote _43__. Vandemeer exploded. __quote _44__. His voice rose to a shout that echoed through the entrance hall, carrying up all 4 floors. __quote _45__. People froze in the corridors. Laboratory assistants stopped on the stairs, holding folders, afraid to move. Scientists carrying test tubes stood motionless, eyes downcast, embarrassed. The entire facility had gone silent, everyone listening to the director's tirade. Vandemeer's face was red, a vein throbbing in his temple, spittle flying from his lips. __quote _46__. He did not wait for an answer. He turned and strode toward the stairs, his footsteps echoing, leaving Marion trembling at her desk. She said nothing, did not defend herself, did not cry. Just sat there, hands folded on the desk, face burning with humiliation, feeling the eyes of dozens of people on her, hearing whispered conversations, knowing everyone was talking about her, judging her, pitying her. And in that moment, the thread snapped. For 18 months she had been afraid. For 18 months she had doubted. For 18 months she had convinced herself that silence was safer, that speaking up was pointless, that she was nobody, and her voice would not matter. But in that moment of public humiliation, something fundamental shifted inside Marion's chest. Harlan Vandemeer had just demonstrated exactly who he was. A man who believed himself above all rules, all accountability, all human decency. A man who treated people as objects, as nothing, as furniture to be discarded. A man who had grown so arrogant in his corruption that he no longer bothered to hide his contempt for ordinary people. And Marion realized, if not me, then who? If not now, then when? She was nobody, but nobody was watching. Nobody knew what she knew. If she remained silent, Vandemeer would continue selling secrets to the enemy, continue embezzling funds, continue sending defective weapons to American soldiers. Men would die. Perhaps men like Clayton, good men who believed they were being protected by their equipment, who trusted that the chemical weapons they carried would work when needed. They would die because she was too afraid to speak. She thought of Clayton, thought of his last letter, written 3 days before he was killed. He had written, "I know you worry about me, but I'm as safe as anyone can be in war. We have good equipment, good training, good leadership. I trust in that. I trust that the people back home are doing their part, making sure we have what we need. That's what keeps me going." What would Clayton think of her if he knew she had information that could save lives but was too afraid to use it? That evening, after her shift ended at 3 o'clock, Marion did not return to Estelle's tenement. Instead, she walked 12 blocks through cold October drizzle to the Baltimore City Central Library on Cathedral Street. She entered, shook rain from her coat, approached the librarian's desk. She requested writing paper and a pen. The librarian, a kind-faced woman in her 60s, provided them. Marion sat at a reading table in the reference room, surrounded by shelves of books, the smell of old paper and ink. And she began to write. She wrote for 4 hours straight, her hand cramping, filling page after page with careful script. She documented everything, every date, every visitor, every conversation, every suspicious transaction, every terminated employee. every irregularity she had witnessed in 18 months. She wrote about the midnight meetings on the 14th and 28th of each month. She provided physical descriptions of the 4 regular visitors: the tall man with the scar, height approximately 6 feet 2 inches, dark hair graying at temples, expensive clothing, military bearing, speaks with what may be a German accent. The heavy-set nervous man with thick glasses, approximately 5 feet 6 inches, round face, always sweating, carries a leather briefcase. The nondescript man of medium height, no distinguishing features, the type of face easily forgotten. The platinum blonde woman, late 30s, European accent, elegant clothing, expensive perfume, stays for extended periods. She quoted conversations she had memorized, including references to quote 48 and quote 49 and quote 50 and quote 51 and quote 52 and quote 53 and quote 54 and quote 55. She described the falsified procurement records, providing specific examples. The Precision Chemical Corporation invoices showing different prices for identical orders. She described the intimidated auditors, naming Eugene Callahan, who was threatened and replaced by Mr. Patterson. She described the disappeared personnel: Dr. Millard Thaddeus Parnell, senior chemist, terminated February 1944 after questioning documentation discrepancies and burn rate irregularities. Captain Theodore Vance, military intelligence officer, removed from security assessment in June 1944 and replaced by Major Russell Pemberton. She described Vandemeer's telephone conversations that included what sounded like German phrases or code words. She detailed the thick envelopes exchanged during daytime meetings with men using obviously false names like John Smith and Robert Jones. She described documents removed from the locked file room before audits. She described visitors who never signed the logbook, despite regulations requiring all visitors to sign. She concluded with a direct statement, her hands steady despite her racing heart. I believe Director Harlan Vandemeer is engaged in espionage on behalf of a foreign power, most likely Nazi Germany. I believe he is selling classified chemical warfare research to enemy agents through a network of handlers who visit the facility on a regular schedule. I believe he is embezzling government funds allocated for war production by falsifying procurement records and inflating costs. I believe he is providing the United States military with falsified research results and defective chemical weapons that may fail under field conditions, thereby endangering American soldiers. I believe he has accomplices in government agencies protecting him from investigation through intimidation and corruption. I believe anyone who threatens to expose him is eliminated through forced termination, reassignment, or possibly worse methods. I am submitting this information to you because I can no longer remain silent. I understand I may be placing myself in grave danger by doing so. I understand that if Director Vandemeer learns I have reported this information, my life will be at risk. But American soldiers are dying every day in Europe and the Pacific. My own husband, Private Clayton R. Hutchins, was killed at Guadalcanal in August 1942. He trusted that the people back home were doing their part, ensuring that he and his fellow soldiers had the equipment and weapons they needed to survive. If the chemical weapons our soldiers rely on are defective because of Vandemeer's sabotage and falsified research, those deaths are on all our hands. I will not be complicit in treason and murder. I will not dishonor my husband's sacrifice by remaining silent. I am prepared to testify to everything I have written here under oath in a court of law. I am prepared to identify the individuals I have described. I understand the risks. I accept them. Please investigate this matter with all urgency. Lives depend on it. She signed the letter. A concerned employee of Cordell Applied Chemistry Laboratory. Further contact can be made through the facility reception desk. She wrote the address on the envelope in clear block letters. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Field Office, 1000 Redwood Street, Baltimore, Maryland. She sealed the envelope, gathered her coat, left the library. She walked 3 blocks through the rain to a postal box on Charles Street. Stood there in the rain for several minutes, the envelope in her hand, her heart pounding. This was the moment. Once she dropped this letter in the box, There was no going back. Her life would change, perhaps end. But she thought of Clayton, thought of Dr. Parnell, thought of Captain Vance, thought of all the soldiers relying on weapons that might fail because one man valued money over their lives. She dropped the letter in the box. Then she walked back to Estelle's tenement through the rain, climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, entered the cramped room. Estelle was out, working the evening shift at the laboratory. Marion lay on her cot fully clothed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to rain drum on the roof. And she wept. Not from fear, though she was afraid. Not from doubt, though she wondered if she had just signed her own death warrant. She wept from relief. For 18 months she had carried a terrible burden alone. Now she had set it down. Whatever happened next, at least she had done the right thing. At least she had tried. 3 days passed, then 5, then a week. Marion went to work each morning, sat at her desk, logged visitors, answered phones. Nothing changed. No FBI agents appeared. No military investigators. No indication her letter had been received or taken seriously. She began to wonder if she had wasted her courage on a futile gesture. Perhaps the letter had been lost in the mail. Perhaps it had been dismissed as the ravings of a confused woman. Perhaps it had reached someone who was part of Vandemeer's network, who had destroyed it. She watched Vandemeer carefully, looking for any sign he knew she had reported him. But he appeared unchanged, arrogant, dismissive, treating her as invisible. He walked past her desk each morning without a glance. The midnight meetings continued on schedule. The suspicious visitors came and went. Marion felt despair creeping over her. She had risked everything for nothing. On October 30th, 12 days after Vandemeer's outburst, a man in a gray suit and fedora entered the laboratory at 8 in the morning, just as the day shift was beginning. He approached Marion's desk and showed her a badge. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent Raymond Corbett. He spoke quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Hutchins, I'd like to speak with you privately. Is there an empty room nearby where we won't be overheard?" Marion's heart hammered. This was it, either rescue or disaster. She led him to a small storage closet off the entrance hall, a cramped space filled with cleaning supplies and extra furniture. Agent Corbett closed the door. In the dim light from a single bulb, he studied her face. Marion hesitated. If this was a trap, if Corbett was working for Vandemeer, she was finished. But she had come this far. She nodded. __quote _62 __. Corbett's expression softened. Everything you described, the dates, the visitors, the conversations, the financial irregularities, can you testify to it under oath in a federal court? Marion: Yes, every word is true. Corbett: You understand the risks? You understand that if we proceed with an investigation and Director Vandemeer suspects you're the source, your life may be in danger? Marion: I understand. Corbett studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You're very brave, Mrs. Hutchins. What you've given us is extraordinary. We've had suspicions about Director Vandemeer for several months. Certain financial irregularities came to our attention through routine War Department oversight. But we had no solid evidence, no eyewitness testimony. Your letter provides the foundation we need to build a case. Marion felt relief wash over her. They believed her. They were taking her seriously. Corbett continued. What happens now is this. We investigate. Quietly. Very quietly. It may take time. Weeks, possibly months. We need to identify the handlers you described, trace the financial transactions, gather documentary evidence. During that period, you must continue working here as if nothing has changed. You cannot give any indication that you've contacted us. Can you do that? Marion thought of the midnight visitors, the cold eyes, the threats. thought of working day after day under Vandemeer's authority, knowing what she knew, wondering every moment if he suspected, if today would be the day she disappeared. But she nodded. Quote 69. Corbett placed a hand on her shoulder. Quote 70. He handed her a business card. Quote 71. Marion thought of Estelle's tenement, the single room they shared. If Vandemeer came looking for her, that would be the first place. I don't know, Corbett thought for a moment. We can arrange protective custody if necessary, but that might alert Vandemeer that something is happening. For now, vary your routine. Don't walk the same route to and from work every day. Be aware of your surroundings. If you see anyone following you, note their description and contact me. Marion nodded, feeling fear settle in her stomach like ice. Agent Corbett left through the front entrance, just another visitor, his name entered in the logbook as Mr. Raymond Collins, War Production Board. Marion returned to her desk. Her hands shook as she opened the visitor log, as she picked up the telephone to answer the first call of the day. But she had done it. The FBI was investigating. Justice was coming. For 6 weeks, Marion lived in a state of controlled terror. Every morning, she varied her route to work, walking different streets, watching reflections in shop windows to see if anyone followed. Every night, she lay awake in Estelle's room, listening to every creak of the building, every footstep in the hallway, wondering if this was the night they came for her. She watched Vandemeer carefully, looking for any sign he knew about the FBI investigation. But he appeared unchanged, arrogant, dismissive, treating her as invisible furniture. The midnight meetings continued on schedule like clockwork. The suspicious visitors came and went. Marion documented everything in her mind, adding details to her mental record, knowing that eventually she would have to testify and every detail might matter. On December 14, 1944, exactly 8 weeks after Marion mailed her letter, federal agents arrived in force. At 6 in the morning, before the day shift began, Marion arrived at the laboratory as usual and found the street blocked by official vehicles. 15 FBI agents and a full squad of military police had surrounded the Cordell Laboratory building. Agent Corbett met her at the corner. Quote, 75, quote, he told her, his voice tight with controlled excitement. Quote, 76, quote. Marion felt lightheaded. After 8 weeks of terror, it was finally happening. She watched as agents entered the building, heard shouting from inside, saw more agents climbing fire escapes to prevent anyone escaping through windows. At 6:30 in the morning, as the first gray light touched the Baltimore rooftops, Harlan Prescott Vandemeer was escorted out in handcuffs. He wore pajamas and a robe. Apparently, he had been sleeping in his fourth-floor office, perhaps expecting an early morning meeting with his handlers. His face was gray, his eyes wild with shock and disbelief. As military police marched him past the vehicles, he looked around frantically, perhaps searching for the person who had betrayed him. His eyes landed on Marion, standing with Agent Corbett. Recognition flickered across his features. Perhaps the first time in 18 months he had truly seen her, truly registered her existence. His expression shifted from shock to disbelief to pure hatred. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to shout accusations, but an MP pulled him forward roughly, pushed him into the back of a military truck. Over the next 4 hours, Marion watched the dismantling of Vandemeer's operation. Agents carried boxes of documents from the building, files, ledgers, correspondence. They carried out file cabinets. They carried out laboratory equipment that had been used to test formulations before selling them to the Germans. She saw 3 other employees arrested: Dr. Wendell Carstairs, a senior chemist who had helped falsify research reports; Mr. Leopold Finch, the chief accountant who had managed the fraudulent invoices; and the night watchman Gerald Kowalski, who Marion now learned had been complicit, deliberately timing his rounds to avoid seeing the midnight visitors, paid $50 a month to look the other way. All 3 were escorted out in handcuffs, looking shocked and frightened. By noon, the laboratory was quiet, sealed off as a crime scene. Agent Corbett approached Marion. Mrs. Hutchins, you should go home. The facility will remain closed for several days while we complete our evidence collection. All personnel are on paid administrative leave. You'll be contacted when we need your testimony, probably in 3 or 4 months when the trial begins. Until then, continue being careful. We've arrested Vandemeer and his accomplices here, but his handlers, the people who visited at night, are still at large. They may try to silence witnesses. Marion felt a chill. She had not thought about that. Corbett continued, "We're offering you protective custody, a safe house where you can stay until the trial." Marion thought about it. Protective custody meant leaving Baltimore, leaving Estelle, leaving everything familiar. But it also meant safety. She nodded. "Yes, I'll accept that." Agent Corbett drove her to Estelle's tenement, waited while she packed a single suitcase. Estelle wept, begging her to be careful. Marion promised to write, promised to return when it was safe. Then Corbett drove her to a small boarding house in Towson, 15 miles north of Baltimore, run by an elderly couple who asked no questions. Marion was given a room on the second floor, told to stay inside as much as possible, told that an agent would check on her daily. For 4 months, Marion lived in that room. She read books borrowed from the Towson Library. She listened to the radio, news of Allied advances through Europe, rumors that the war might end soon. She wrote letters to Estelle, carefully worded to reveal nothing about her location. She waited. The story broke in the Baltimore Sun in late December, quote 80. The articles were vague on details. National security concerns prevented full disclosure, but confirmed that multiple arrests had been made, that classified research had been compromised, that an ongoing investigation involved German intelligence operations on American soil. The newspapers did not mention Marion's name. She was referred to only as a facility employee whose observations led to the investigation. In April 1945, as Allied forces swept through Germany and victory in Europe appeared imminent, the trial began in federal court in downtown Baltimore. Marion was brought from the safe house under armed escort. She wore her best dress, the one she had worn to Clayton's funeral 3 years earlier. She sat in the witness waiting room, her hands folded in her lap, trying to control her breathing. When she was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand on trembling legs. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, government officials, military observers, members of the public who had gotten tickets. Harlan Vandemeer sat at the defense table in a dark suit, flanked by 2 expensive lawyers. He stared at Marion with undisguised hatred. Marion was sworn in. The prosecutor, a tall man named Mr. Bradford, approached. __quote _82 __. Marion's voice was soft but steady. "I work as reception desk security at Cordell Applied Chemistry Laboratory." Bradford: "How long have you held that position?" Marion: "Since December 1942, 2 years and 4 months. Bradford: "During that time, what was your relationship with the defendant, Director Harlan Vandemeer?" Marion: "He was my superior. I reported to him." Bradford: "Did Director Vandemeer speak to you regularly?" Marion paused. "No, sir. In 18 months, Director Vandemeer never once greeted me, never once addressed me by name, never once acknowledged my existence except to shout at me on October 18, 1944. For 2 full days, Marion testified. She recited dates, times, descriptions, conversations from memory. She described the midnight visitors in detail, their heights, their clothing, their mannerisms, the words they spoke. She described the falsified invoices, naming specific companies and amounts. She described the terminated employees who had questioned irregularities. She described the disappeared auditors and investigators. Defense attorneys tried to discredit her. They suggested she was confused, mistaken, perhaps suffering from grief-related delusions after her husband's death. They asked how she could possibly remember such specific details. Marion replied calmly, quote, They asked why she had waited so long to report. Marion looked directly at Vandemeer. Quote, FBI agents corroborated her account with evidence seized from Vandemeer's office. Coded correspondence with German handlers arranged through a network of intermediaries in Argentina and Mexico. Financial records showing deposits totaling $340,000 in Swiss bank accounts. Falsified research documentation where test results had been altered to make defective formulations appear functional. Procurement records showing systematic inflation of costs. The case against Vandemeer was overwhelming. On May 7, 1945, coincidentally, the same day Germany surrendered in Europe, Harlan Prescott Vandemeer was convicted on 17 counts: espionage, treason, conspiracy to commit espionage, embezzlement of government funds, conspiracy to defraud the United States, falsifying official documents, obstruction of justice, bribery of government officials, murder conspiracy, related to Captain Vance, whose body had been found in the Chesapeake Bay in November 1944, and 8 other charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, said, "You betrayed your country in its darkest hour. You sold secrets to our enemies. You sent American soldiers into battle with defective weapons. You enriched yourself while good men died. You deserve no mercy." Vandemeer showed no emotion as he was led away. The 3 co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. 2 of the German handlers identified from Marion's descriptions were later captured in Mexico and extradited to the United States, where they were convicted of espionage and executed. The other 2 were never found, presumably having fled to South America or Europe. The trial revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Vandemeer had been recruited by German intelligence in early 1942 while attending an international scientific conference in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a neutral country where Axis agents operated openly. He had provided the Germans with classified research on incendiary weapons, chemical irritants, and smokescreen formulations. He had falsified test results on multiple munitions contracts, ensuring that certain chemical weapons would fail under field conditions, flashbang grenades that would not detonate, smokescreen canisters that would not disperse, decontamination solutions that would not neutralize toxic agents. FBI analysis suggested that Vandemeer's sabotage had directly caused the failure of at least 3 military operations in the Pacific Theater, resulting in estimated 40 to 60 American casualties. He had embezzled over $300,000 in procurement funds through inflated invoices and phantom contracts. He had maintained the espionage operation for nearly 2 years, protected by a network of corrupt officials in contracting agencies, oversight boards, and even military intelligence, officials who were subsequently arrested and tried separately. Marion's testimony had broken the case open. Without her detailed observations, prosecutors acknowledged, Vandemeer might have operated undetected for years, perhaps through the war's end and beyond. The prosecutor, Mr. Bradford, said in his closing statement, "This case was solved not by sophisticated intelligence work, not by cryptography or surveillance, but by one ordinary woman who paid attention, who watched, who remembered, who found the courage to speak when silence would have been easier and safer. Mrs. Marion Hutchins is the hero of this story." When the trial concluded, newspapers finally identified Marion by name and published her photograph. The Baltimore Sun ran a feature story. "Widow's courage breaks Nazi spy ring. Receptionist testimony convicts traitor." The article described her as an unassuming war widow whose keen observations and photographic memory brought down one of the war's most damaging espionage operations on American soil. Other newspapers across the country picked up the story. For a week, Marion was besieged by reporters, photographers, people wanting interviews. Radio stations requested her to appear on programs. A publisher offered her money to write a book about her experiences. She declined everything. She had not done this for recognition or profit. She had done it because it was necessary, because it was right. The Cordell Laboratory reopened in June 1945 under new management. The War Department appointed Dr. Everett Dalton Kress, a respected chemist from the Bureau of Mines who had no connection to Vandemeer's network, as director. Dr. Kress's first official act was to visit Marion, who had returned to work in late May after the trial concluded, and thank her personally. He found her at her desk, logging visitors as she had done for 2.5 years. "Mrs. Hutchins," he said, extending his hand, "you saved this institution and possibly saved hundreds of lives. We owe you everything." Marion, uncomfortable with praise, simply nodded and shook his hand. "Doctor," Kress continued, "I want to make sure you understand something. You are valued here. You are seen. You are essential. You are not invisible. Not anymore. Not ever again." Marion felt tears prick her eyes. For the first time in years, perhaps since Clayton's death, she felt truly seen. Dr. Kress smiled gently. __quote _99 __. Under Dr. Kress's leadership, the laboratory culture transformed completely. He instituted an open-door policy for all staff regardless of rank. He encouraged employees to report concerns without fear of retaliation. He held regular all-hands meetings where even the most junior employees could ask questions and voice opinions. He fired the remaining members of Vandemeer's inner circle and hired new staff based on competence and integrity. He made a point of greeting Marion every single morning, asking about her health, her welfare, whether she needed anything. Other senior staff followed his example. The laboratory became a different place, collaborative, transparent, honest. Scientists began stopping at Marion's desk to chat, to ask her opinion on matters unrelated to chemistry. They asked where to find good housing in Baltimore, how to navigate the city's neighborhoods, whether she had recommendations for doctors, dentists, schools for their children. She became gradually visible, not just a fixture, but a person, a valued person. She offered advice, made introductions, helped newcomers adjust to Baltimore life. She became the heart of the laboratory, the person everyone knew and trusted. In particular, Marion developed a close relationship with a young chemist named Dwight Osborne Meacham. Dwight had joined the laboratory in June 1944, just months before the Vandemeer scandal exploded. He was 26 years old, from a small town called Hazard in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. Brilliant but socially awkward, classified 4F due to severe myopia that made him nearly blind without his thick glasses. He had come to Baltimore knowing absolutely no one, rented a miserable room in a boarding house where the landlady served watery soup and stale bread, and spent his first months desperately lonely. Marion noticed his isolation immediately, saw how he ate lunch alone in the corner of the cafeteria, how he left work exactly at quitting time and hurried away, how he never joined colleagues for the occasional after-work gatherings at nearby bars or restaurants. His loneliness was palpable, painful to witness. One day in August 1945, shortly after the war ended and the laboratory was celebrating VJ Day with a party, Marion saw Dwight standing alone in a corner, holding a paper cup of punch, looking miserable while everyone else laughed and danced. She approached him, introduced herself properly, though of course he knew who she was, everyone knew the woman who had caught the spy, and invited him to have coffee at her desk during his next break. Dwight, surprised and grateful, accepted. They talked for an hour that first time. Dwight spoke about his family back in Kentucky, his parents who ran a small general store, his 3 younger siblings, the mountains he missed, the streams where he had fished as a boy. He spoke about how much he hated Baltimore, the noise, the crowds, the unfamiliar food, the way people talk so fast and never seem to have time for conversation. He spoke about how difficult it was to make friends, how everyone seemed to already have their own social circles, and he could not figure out how to break in. Marion listened without judgment. She understood loneliness, had lived with it for 3 years since Clayton's death. She offered advice, suggested places he might find community, churches that welcomed newcomers, libraries with reading groups, social organizations for war workers and veterans. She told him about a church in Canton where the congregation was friendly and welcoming, where they served dinner after Sunday services and newcomers were always invited. From that day forward, Dwight stopped at Marion's desk every morning when he arrived, and every afternoon before he left. They became friends. Marion introduced him to other people at the laboratory, including a young woman named Lucille Tremaine, a laboratory assistant from Pennsylvania who was also new to Baltimore and also lonely. Marion invited them both to have lunch together, facilitated conversations, gently encouraged what she could see was a mutual attraction. Dwight and Lucille began dating. A year later, in 1947, they married. Marion attended the wedding, sat in the front row beside Dwight's parents who had traveled from Kentucky, wept with joy as the couple exchanged vows. When Dwight and Lucille's first child was born in 1948, a daughter they named Constance Marion Meacham, with Marion as the middle name, they asked Marion to be godmother. She accepted, honored and overwhelmed. For years afterward, Marion spent almost every Sunday with the Meacham family. She had dinner with them, played with the children. 2 more arrived, a son named Thomas in 1950 and another daughter named Eleanor in 1953, became a beloved, quote, 100, who brought small gifts, told stories, provided advice on everything from teething to school troubles. The Meacham children called her Aunt Marion and loved her as family. For Marion, who had never had children of her own, this was a gift beyond measure. She had lost Clayton. She had lost the future they had planned. But she had found a different kind of family. The laboratory continued its work through the post-war years. The focus shifted from munitions to industrial chemistry, development of new polymers, synthetic materials, pharmaceuticals, agricultural chemicals. The staff grew to over 300 employees. The facility expanded into adjacent buildings, then built entirely new wings. Federal funding increased as the Cold War began, and chemical research became strategically important. Marion remained at her post through it all, the familiar face at the entrance desk. But now she was greeted by name every morning. Now people stopped to talk, to ask her advice, to share their lives with her. Now she mattered. In 1966, on the 25th anniversary of the laboratory's establishment, the staff organized a major celebration. There were speeches, awards, reminiscences, a formal dinner at a downtown hotel. Dr. Kress, still director after 21 years, gave a keynote address about the institution's history, the difficult war years, the expansion in peacetime, the important research conducted, the bright future ahead. Then he spoke about the dark period under Vandemeer, about how close the laboratory had come to complete collapse, to being shut down permanently as a security risk, about how one person's extraordinary courage had saved everything. He invited Marion to the front of the auditorium. She walked forward reluctantly, embarrassed by the attention. The entire staff, 300 people in formal attire, stood and applauded. The applause went on for nearly 5 minutes. People were crying. Dr. Kress presented her with an engraved plaque. In recognition of extraordinary service to the nation and to this institution, Marion Delphine Hutchins, a model of integrity, courage, and devotion to duty. Without her vigilance and bravery, this laboratory would not exist today. Marion worked at Cordell Laboratory until 1976, retiring at age 75 after 34 years of service. Her retirement party filled the main auditorium. Dwight Meacham, now a senior research director and author of several important papers on polymer chemistry, gave a speech about how Marion had saved him from loneliness and depression when he first arrived in Baltimore, how she had become family to him and his wife and children, how she had taught him that kindness and attention to others mattered as much as scientific brilliance. Lucille Meacham presented Marion with a scrapbook containing photographs, letters, and testimonials from dozens of employees. Stories about how Marion had helped them in small and large ways over the years, had welcomed them, guided them, supported them. The War Department sent an official commendation letter, signed by the Secretary of the Army, thanking Marion for exceptional and courageous service to national security during wartime. Marion lived quietly in retirement. She remained extraordinarily close to the Meacham family. She attended every birthday party, every school play, every graduation. She watched Constance grow up and go to college, become a teacher. She watched Thomas become an engineer. She watched Eleanor become a nurse. She attended Constance's wedding in 1970, cried as she had at Dwight and Lucille's wedding 23 years earlier. She volunteered at St. Michael's Catholic Church in Fells Point, helping with the food pantry and visiting sick parishioners. She read voraciously, mysteries, biographies, history books. She took long walks along the harbor, watching ships come and go, thinking about Clayton, about the long journey her life had taken. She never married again. Clayton had been the love of her life, and after his death she never sought another partner. She had opportunities. Several men expressed interest over the years, including a kind widower from her church who proposed marriage in 1955. But she declined gently. Her heart belonged to Clayton. She lived simply, in a small apartment she had rented in 1946 when she finally moved out of Estelle's tenement, surrounded by books and photographs and memories. She passed away in her sleep on March 8, 1994, at age 93. The funeral was held at St. Michael's Catholic Church. Over 200 people attended, former colleagues from the laboratory spanning decades of employment, members of the Meacham family including Constance's teenage children, Marion's __103__, neighbors, friends from church. Dwight Meacham, now 76 years old and retired, delivered the eulogy. He spoke about Marion's quiet strength, her unwavering integrity, her kindness to a lonely young man far from home who had nobody. He concluded, his voice breaking, "Marion taught me that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a woman sitting at a desk, watching, remembering, waiting for the right moment to speak. She saved lives by exposing a traitor. She saved an institution by refusing to remain silent. She saved me by offering friendship when I had none. We will never forget her. We cannot forget her. She changed our lives." Marion was buried at Greenmount Cemetery beside Clayton Hutchins, whose remains had been returned from Guadalcanal in 1948 and reinterred there. Her headstone reads simply, Marion Delphine Hutchins, 1901 to 1994. She saw. She remembered. She spoke. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of the Vandemeer scandal and Marion's courageous testimony, the Cordell Laboratory, now renamed the Cordell Institute for Applied Chemical Research, a prestigious institution with international reputation, opened a small historical archive and museum. The institute's director, Dr. Ramona Isabel Covington, believed passionately that the institution should remember not only its scientific achievements, but the people who built and protected it. "Science is done by human beings," Dr. Covington said at the opening ceremony attended by staff, retirees, local officials, and members of the Meacham family. "And we must remember not only those who stood at laboratory benches with test tubes and beakers, but those who stood at entrance desks defending integrity and justice. Without Marion Hutchins, this institution would not exist. We honor her memory today and every day." One entire room in the archive is dedicated to Marion. A large photograph occupies the central wall. Marion at her desk, 1965, a black and white professional photograph enlarged to 4 feet by 3 feet. She sits with her hands folded on the visitor logbook, looking directly at the camera with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. Her eyes are calm, wise, kind. Behind her is the entrance door with its frosted glass panel. Symbolically, she stands at the threshold between the outside world and the world of science. Guardian, gatekeeper, protector. Beside the photograph is a detailed biographical plaque rendered in bronze. Marion Delphine Hutchins, 1901 to 1994. Born in Willow Creek, Virginia. Widowed in August 1942 after her husband, Private Clayton R. Hutchins, was killed at Guadalcanal. Marion came to Baltimore and worked as reception desk security at Cordell Laboratory from December 1942 to 1976. During World War II, she observed and meticulously documented espionage activities by Laboratory Director Harlan Vandemeer. Her detailed anonymous letter to the FBI in October 1944 led to Vandemeer's arrest and conviction, breaking a major German intelligence operation and saving countless Allied lives. Her courage exemplifies civic duty, integrity, and devotion to justice. She received commendations from the War Department and the FBI. She is remembered as a model of quiet heroism and moral courage. Display cases contain artifacts from Marion's workspace. Her visitor logbook from 1960, its pages yellowed with age, filled with thousands of names in her neat handwriting. Her reading glasses in simple wire frames, the lenses thick and scratched from decades of use. The electric hot plate on which she made coffee for herself and visiting colleagues. A white ceramic mug with a gold rim given to her by the staff on her retirement. Inscribed, __, quote, _, 109, __. A photograph of Clayton in his army uniform. The same photo Marion kept on her desk for 34 years. These simple objects carry the memory of thousands of days at that desk, thousands of people passing through, thousands of quiet moments that comprise the laboratory's daily life. On another wall hang photographs from different eras showing Marion with staff members and friends. A Christmas party in 1972, where Marion is surrounded by younger colleagues, everyone wearing festive sweaters and smiling. A company picnic in 1974 at a park along the Patapsco River. The 1966 25th anniversary celebration where Marion stands at the podium holding her plaque, looking simultaneously proud and embarrassed. In every photograph, Marion is at the center, surrounded by people looking at her with obvious warmth and respect. These are not images of a clerk and scientists maintaining professional distance. These are images of family. A separate display focuses extensively on the Meacham family relationship. Letters from Dwight describing Marion as the person who saved my life when I arrived in Baltimore alone, lost, and drowning in loneliness. She threw me a lifeline of friendship, and I grabbed it and held on. Photographs of Marion holding baby Constance at her christening in 1948, Marion's face glowing with joy. A handwritten note from Lucille Meacham dated 1955, __, quote, _111, __. A crayon drawing made by young Thomas Meacham, age 6, showing stick figures labeled __, quote, _112, __. A high school essay written by Eleanor Meacham in 1971 titled __, quote, _113, that describes Marion's courage during the Vandemeer case and concludes, Aunt Marion taught me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they have courage and conscience. She is my hero and my inspiration. These documents and images show that Marion was far more than an employee of the institution. She was its heart, its conscience, its soul. The archive is visited regularly by current and former employees, by students studying wartime history and espionage, by researchers examining civilian contributions to military security, by groups learning about civic courage and moral responsibility. Tours are conducted 3 times weekly. Lectures are given about the importance of speaking up against injustice, about the role of ordinary citizens in protecting democracy, about how one person's actions can change the course of events. Marion's story has become part of educational curricula at local schools and universities, used as a case study in ethics classes, history courses, and leadership training programs. She represents the principle that courage comes in many forms, that heroism is not always loud or dramatic, that sometimes the most important act is simply refusing to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. Everyone who visits the archive stops before that central photograph of Marion at her desk. They read her story. They learn about a woman who was invisible for years and then became a hero. They learn that ordinary people possess extraordinary power if they choose to use it. The story was never sensational. No Hollywood movies, no best-selling books, no national medals or parades. But it was profoundly important. It demonstrated that even the most overlooked person can change the world. You simply must refuse to remain silent. Refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Refuse to become complicit in evil, even when compliance seems easier and safer. Marion remained silent for 18 months, but when the moment came, when her conscience finally outweighed her fear, she spoke. And her voice proved louder than the director's shouting, louder than the whispers of conspiracy, louder than the clinking of medals and awards. Her voice was the voice of truth, and truth ultimately prevailed. At Cordell Institute, a tradition established by Dr. Kress in 1945 continues to this very day. Every new director on their first day of work must approach the reception desk, shake the current receptionist's hand warmly, and ask their name. Must acknowledge them as a person, as a valued member of the team. This tradition has endured for nearly 80 years, and as long as it lives, the Institute remembers, every person matters. Every person sees. Every person can change everything. Marion knew this truth. She lived it. And she left that knowledge to those who came after her. The knowledge that justice does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it takes 18 months of watching and waiting and gathering evidence. But it comes. If there is one person unwilling to stay silent, one person willing to say, enough. That person can be anyone, a professor or a janitor, a director or a receptionist. It does not matter what title you hold or what position you occupy. Only one thing matters: being human, a real human being, with conscience, honor, dignity. Marion Delphine Hutchins was such a person, and her story teaches us that invisible people sometimes see more than anyone else. That when they finally find the courage to speak, the world listens. Because their words, born from patient observation and unwavering integrity, are truth. And truth is always stronger than any lie. Always.